Carlo, for being with us. And now, it's my real pleasure to introduce to you Stefano Zamagni for his keynote. I have been attending keynotes and talk of Stefano since 1991 when I was a PhD student, and I took a train from Genoa to Milan to go to listen to his words. And he has been a unique researcher and professor in the area of explaining the role of volunteering people, the role of motivating people beyond the pure economic reasons, direct economic reasons. And so I feel he's a professor of University of Bologna, Professor Emeritus. He's president of a Pontifical Academy related to the subject. He's also professor of Johns Hopkins University. So he has multiple academic titles, which I cannot briefly summarize here. But, I would like to express to him my deepest gratitude for his participation at this event, and just move the word directly to him. Stefano.
Thank you very much, Professor Succi, for this presentation. It was a pleasure for me to accept your kind invitation to participate to this conference. I've never been and never visited before in Polis, but I understand from the information that I was able to collect that it's a growing, rapidly growing university. So many congratulations to you and all your collaborators. Now, in this presentation, I will offer some consideration to your attention of some of the problems that in the present epoch, characterized by the fourth industrial revolution, in particular the digital revolution, mean the implication of these facts on organizations in general, and in particular to the so-called open source, which is the topic of your conference. But even though my argument refers to any type of enterprise, both big and medium and small size. Let me start from this consideration. Whenever and wherever there is a division of labor, there is a problem of coordination emerging, because division of labor generates or implies the necessity of coordination. Two are the models of coordination, which in the literature are called technological coordination and strategic coordination. What's the difference? The technological coordination is one which follows from the protocols. In other words, every participant to the process receives a protocol where are included the instruction, and what he or she is supposed to do is irrespective of what other colleagues are doing. On the other hand, the strategic coordination is one where what I decided to do and how I perform to do depends on the expectations, on the behavior of others. That is why Thomas Schelling, Nobel Prize winner, an American scholar, very famous, already many years ago, characterized the strategic coordination as a meeting of minds. That is beautiful, especially. Meeting of minds means it's not a meeting of tasks to be performed, but of minds. Now, to understand this point even better, it's proper that we can distinguish three basically behavioral patterns that we can observe in the population, whatever it is. There is the antisocial, asocial, and prosocial behavior. What is antisocial behavior? It's the behavior of somebody who enjoys to provoke damage of one type or the other to others. The typical example of an antisocial behavior is envy. Envious people are those people who are prepared to sacrifice some of their resources in order to provoke a major damage to other people. Who is an asocial? Asocial, which means non-social, on the other hand, is somebody who only cares about himself or herself. The asocial behavior is typical of the so-called Homo economicus. Homo economicus is somebody who does not enjoy in damaging others, but at the same time is somebody who is not prepared to help others. So is what is called the neutral fellow. Finally, pro-social, you have already understood, is somebody who, in acting in a particular way, aims at favoring his or her own objective function as well as the interest or the purpose of other people. Now, what is then the implication in terms of the model of coordination? That if you, the manager, so to speak, puts in the same environment, for instance, the same laboratory, the same office, etc., one who is antisocial and the other one who is pro-social, what happens is a disaster. Because the antisocial always wins against a pro-social. Why? Because an antisocial can use strategies or methods, for instance, fake truth, or speaking against even though that does not correspond to truth, etc. A pro-social fellow never will do that. So this is an important implication. The role of managers today, and most of them, are unable to understand this point. That is the tragedy, because they put people in the various positions of the organization irrespective of the so-called behavioral pattern. They only look at the CV, the so-called, but CV is irrelevant nowadays, because CV only tells what one fellow has done in the past. For instance, which grades, what he or she is able to do, etc. But in the CV, you will never observe expression such as I am antisocial, I am pro-social, etc. So that is why today many organizations fail to obtain the best results, because the managers do not know, are not capable in what is called ars combinatoria, which is Latin, which means the art of combination. It's like in an orchestra, where the director of the orchestra should know how to combine the different instruments. The same is true with managers. But I remind you, this is an art which is very seldom observed in actual behavior of our managers. The second implication of what I'm saying has to do with the phenomena of the so-called knowledge. As you know, Michael Polanyi, a famous philosopher as well as an economist, he was original from a Czech Republic, but then he migrated to the States during the war. In the early 60s, he published a fundamental work, which is called tacit knowledge. And he's the one who introduced the expression tacit knowledge. And that again is something I find very strange. Very few people have read this book. That is a disaster. Because in that book, Polanyi distinguished two types of knowledge, what he called codified knowledge and tacit knowledge. What's the difference? Codified knowledge is a type of knowledge which can be transmitted from one fellow to another or from one office to another via protocols or books. I write a book, the book incorporates my knowledge, you read my book, and then you obtain the knowledge which initially was in my head, in my mind, etc. On the other hand, tacit knowledge is a type of knowledge which can be transmitted only via interpersonal relations. That is why it is called tacit. Consider, for instance, I am an employee. I have a bright idea how to innovate in my organization. Now, unless I feel like that, even my boss, even my manager cannot extract this knowledge which is inside of myself. Because, as I said, the externalization of tacit knowledge presupposes what is called relationality. It's a relational good. Now, the point is the following. Today, the success of organization as well as enterprise depends on the capacity of that organization to mobilize the tacit knowledge which is embodied in everybody. Because each one of us is a bearer of a tacit knowledge. Some people more, others less, but everybody is a bearer of some ideas, brilliant, one type or the other. So unless the organization is capable of, so to speak, convincing those who have tacit knowledge to externalize, there is no way to obtain it. And that explains why two different enterprises operating in the same milieu, in the setup, one is successful, the other one almost goes to bankruptcy. And people ask, how is it possible? This is one of the major answers. Because if the organization does not allow to operate this transfer of tacit knowledge, that organization will never innovate, in particular, will never be able to do disruptive innovation. So I move to the third point. Now, what is the way, the strategies to follow in order to extract tacit knowledge from everybody participating to an organization whatsoever? To answer this question, we have to distinguish that we human beings, we follow two different motivational patterns. What is called extrinsic motivations and intrinsic motivations. We say that a person is motivated extrinsically if he or she operates, does what he's doing, only in view of the remuneration, which could be monetary remuneration or even in a different way, doesn't matter, that obtains. It is as if you ask a physician, why did you choose to become a physician? Some people say, because I know that a physician is a well-paid occupation, well-paid job. In that case, you conclude by saying that person has extrinsic motivation. What about intrinsic motivation? It's the motivation which induces me to do something because I believe that my doing something, that particular action, is good. It's good for one reason or another. People might have different reasons. You can have religious beliefs. You can have any other type of belief. That is not the point. The point is that I operate because having intrinsic motivation, because I know that what I'm doing is functional to the increments of the common good, what is called common good. Now, having clarified that, what is the implication? Implication is that as the literature, empirical literature confirms us, there is a strict link between intrinsic motivation and tacit quality. In other words, people having intrinsic motivation tends to externalize their tacit knowledge. So if they have an idea, if they have a project, and they have a whatever, they naturally tends to externalize. So that is why one of the major problems today in the theory of organizations, and in particular in the practice of organization, is exactly that. How to incentivize people to adopt intrinsic motivation. Or in other words, what are the factors from which the intrinsic motivation behavior depends? Because it is obvious that in each one of us, in every human being, there is a percentage of both motivations. Even extrinsic motivation are important, because without that, we would starve. The problem is the proportion. There are certain people who have 99% of extrinsic motivation, other people who have only 10%, just to give you stupid numbers, etc. So the question, again, it's a matter of proportionality. Now, coming back to my question, these different, let's say, proportions depends on frequencies of types of motivation, depends on what? In other words, what are the factors determining the reality that in a particular country, in a particular environment, in a particular community, the majority of people operates with intrinsic motivations, and in other contexts, the opposite is true? That is the big fundamental question. The answer to the question is that two are the major factors. One has to do with the culture pattern, what is called culture. You know, culture is an important word which is not to be confused with the formation or instruction. Certainly, instruction, formation is part of culture, but culture has to do with the forms of mindset which are predominant in a particular environment. And the cultural models, and today we talk about corporate culture, for instance, and I'm sure that you keep on reading expression of the following type. This particular firm has developed let's say, corporate culture of this type, etc., etc. Now, the cultural patterns depends on the different types of philosophical or ethical stances that one chooses for himself or for themselves. As you know, there are two fundamental ethical matrices. One is utilitarianism. The other one is virtue ethics. So when you happen to hear people talking about business ethics or ethical argument, you have always to stop the person talking and say, please, you have to specify which type of ethics are you talking about. Because utilitarian ethics is completely different from virtue ethics. Virtue ethics was born 2,400 years ago in Greece by Aristotle. Aristotle, the great philosopher, Greek philosopher, is the one who laid down the foundation of virtue ethics, or the ethics of virtue. And the basic idea is that education is meant to incentivize people to the practice of virtue. And you know that virtue is an attitude whereby you operate in view of the good. Could be common good, localized good, that is irrelevant. On the other hand, the utilitarianism is a philosophical, moral philosophical theory, which was born in UK, and the name is Jeremy Bentham. His fundamental book was published in 1789. And where he states, Bentham was a philosopher, not an economist, where he says the main motivation of people is to maximize utility. In other words, if you ask why you and not the other thing, because the answer according to Bentham is because I want to maximize my utility function under constraint. So the utilitarian principle says that human beings behave in a particular way in order to obtain more and more utility. So now already you understand a major implication in terms of cultural pattern. I give you one important example, historical example. I don't know if you have heard the name of Ayn Rand. Ayn Rand, R-A-N-D. Ayn Rand, she was born in Russia, in Moscow. And she, immediately after the war, she emigrated to the United States. And she became very, very famous. In 1957, she published a book, be careful, the title of which is The Virtue of Selfishness. Now, this book was translated into many different languages, and it is still the mostly sold book after the Bible. The book mostly sold is the Bible, as you know, all over the world. Now, the second was The Virtue of Self. What does she say in this book? That to behave in a selfish way, which means maximize your own utility function, is the fundamental virtue. And she concludes by saying, we, the government, should punish and put to prison all those who are pro-social, because pro-social people are dangerous, are enemy to the society. Now, she founded a movement. Today, that movement has disappeared. But for almost 30 years, 30, 40 years, the movement is called objectivistic movement. And it determined a cultural pattern in America as well as in Western Europe, because people believed that she was okay. And what is even more serious is that a man like very influential, who was the president of the Fed, the central bank in America, he became, after the death of Ayn Rand, the president of this movement. And when, after the crisis, financial crisis of the year 2007, 2008, the Congress in America called the president of Fed, and they asked him, but do you realize the mistakes that you are doing? And because of your mistakes, you are provoked a major disaster in terms of results. You see, this man was Alan Greenspan. And you know what was the answer? That honestly, he said in front of the Congress, he said, yes, the point is that I believed in the ideology of Ayn Rand. She manipulated my mind, and I ended by behaving according to what she wrote in the book. Now I beg pardon, because I realized that that was pure ideology. And so I have to beg the pardon to all Americans and also other countries in the world for the mistakes they've been doing. Now, these are facts. And that tells you the importance. What does it mean, cultural pattern? When a utilitarian ethical matrix is spread around, as Ayn Rand tried to do, the disasters are always. Because all the major disasters in economic terms derive from this attitude. So that is why it is important to talk in these terms, because otherwise there will be no way to overcome the many difficulties, both at the level of individual organization and at the level of societies at large, etc. The other factor determining the cultural mindset is the legal system, and that is obvious. The first factor is the culture, or if you want to say the philosophy, etc. The second factor is the legal system. Because if our parliaments keeps on producing laws which are based on the utilitarian calculus, it is obvious that the individual organizations, they have to follow those rules. And if you are interested in this, try to read the book, which was published a few months ago in the United States by Catherine Pistor. It's a fascinating book. The title of that book is The Code of Capital. Read it. You will change many of the prevailing ideas. She's professor in Princeton University. She has a chair of, let's say, law, business law, something like that. And she explains with actual reference to data how, let's say, bad laws generates bad people. Bad people in the sense that we are discussing. So now we come toward the conclusion. What is the final conclusion of this? That the time has come to overcome the Tayloristic model of organization. Because I don't know in Russia, because you see, I've been in Russia several times, but I do not have a direct knowledge. I have a direct knowledge what happens in my country, Italy, as well as other countries, such as Spain, France, Germany, etc. One fact is that our companies continue to behave according to the Tayloristic model. Now, Taylor was an American engineer who in 1911 published the fundamental book, the title of which is The Scientific Organization of Work. Now, this book played a major role in many different contexts, even in the schooling system and in many different countries. Now, I tell you something that since you are Russian, you might be interested. After the revolution in Russia by Lenin, 1917, one of the first decisions taken by Lenin, was the translation of the Taylor's book into Russian. And Lenin imposed to all the managers of the Russian factories the adoption of that model. And he said, this is the model of organization which fits the needs of revolutionary Russia. Now, Lenin, who was very intelligent, as you know, he understood that if you wanted to increase productivity, because Taylor is the man who invented the assembly line. Assembly line before did not exist. And assembly line increased the productivity. And so Lenin, in spite of the fact that Taylor was a capitalistic fellow, he got it translated. Just to give you the idea of the influence. Now, what is the good news from my point of view? That nowadays, Taylorism is over, is finished. But most organizations continue with no responsibility to apply it. Now, what was the basic idea of Taylorism? The hierarchy, verticality. The one on the top, they are always right, and they should command. The other should obey. Read the book by Taylor. What is written in chapter number 2? He says, how should we treat people working at the assembly line? As if, he writes, as if they were cattle. Cattle. In other words, the people like animals. Of course, under those conditions, productivity increased. But nowadays, that is no longer the case. Because at the time of the new technological revolution, we need that everybody should think. Everybody should be put in the condition to externalize their test knowledge. That is why, instead of the Tayloristic model of organization, today is gaining ground another model, which is called holocracy or holocratic model. Now, this name, holocracy, is a Greek name, and it was introduced for the first time by Brian Robertson, professor of management studies at Harvard Business School, Harvard in the States, the #1. And in the year 2007, he published this book whose title is Holocracy. And the holocratic model is exactly the opposite of the Tayloristic model. That is why, concluding, because I have only 1 minute remained, those who, like you, who are interested in open source should consider that. You will never be able to realize open source at a certain scale if you remain within Taylorism. No way, it's impossible. You have to adopt the other model, because holocratic model is not vertical, but horizontal. And horizontal means that in the holocratic model, you do not have somebody who says, I am the boss, I am the commander. No, only those who really deserve, who have the knowledge, take decision together with the other. In that sense, it is no longer hierarchical, but it is horizontal, etc. So in conclusion, that is why I believe that it's important to consider that. because this is one case where increasing the efficiency and productivity of our systems goes hand to hand with making people happier. Because people do not like to be treated as cattle. That is the point. Do not like. And if you want to make people happy, you know what does mean happiness? Happiness means flourishing. You are happy when you flourish, when you develop your potential. That is the way. Otherwise, we will continue to have major problems, and the pandemic in these days is another confirmation of what Strong is doing. So in conclusion, many wishes for your work, and I really expect you to do and to make a major contribution in this direction. So I have to stop because Professor Succi allowed me only 30 minutes, and I always obey to the boss. He's the boss, etc.
I am not by any means a boss. Let me thank for the extremely inspiring talk, Professor Zamagni, who has always surprises us with his unique ideas. And I have a few questions which piled up. I have Joy, a colleague, who is ready to talk. Joy, can you make yourself visible? I cannot see you. Good.
Oh, good. I'm unmuted now. Okay. So thank you so much for the talk. And I think it's really important that we not only just look at what to do, but also how we go about doing it and the philosophy behind it. So thank you for bringing that. I'm just wondering about the connection between the idea of tacit knowledge when it comes to these classified antisocial behaviors. Because I could see a disruptive act as being antisocial, but without disruption, we at times can't have movement against the direction of the group. If the group's moving even against their own best interests, and somebody can see that and others cannot. So how do we kind of meet with the need for disruption in the society to allow for innovation, which you could see as inherently being anti or asocial to the group's perspective in a healthy way, and turn that into a pro-social action? Or is this even a folly in the thinking? Should we always be wanting harmony and pro-social acts at all?
Yes, this is a relevant question. Thank you for raising. That is why I stress so much the cultural factor, because this change, as the Germans say, in other words, the vision of the world cannot occur immediately. It takes time. And one needs to have patience, because you cannot change the mindset of a person in a very short time. But that does not imply that things should not be done. For instance, when we talk about the knowledge economy, as everybody knows, in the year of the question is that the real factor today, strategic factor of success, is knowledge. In the past, the factor of success was having raw materials, to have iron, to coal, today oil. But that is no longer true, because the real, if you want to have disruptive innovations in the sense of Christensen, the one who invented this expression, you really need to operate via the creativity and innovativity of people. But creativity, innovativity is belongs to what Polanyi calls tacit knowledge. So the real question is, how do I incentivize people to put into action this creativity, which is more or less present in everybody? So that is why I said that we need to change the model organization. Holacracy is a model whereby if, even though you are a young fellow and you have an idea, you should be allowed to externalize. Now, let me give you an actual example, which occurred 4 years ago. We are in Washington. In Washington, there are museums. And the museums in Washington, as you know, they behave like an enterprise, because they are considered in that way. Okay. One day, the director made a meeting with his collaborators in order to decide on the following problem. The museum, which is called the Smithsonian Museum, had hosted in the previous weeks a major exhibition of paintings. And so the director was interested in knowing which paintings or which, let's say, rooms of the exhibition were mostly attracted the interest of the visitors, because in this way he could replicate elsewhere the same exhibition. And then he started the discussion. One of his collaborators said, I propose to make an interview via internet, asking blah, 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 etc. The cost of that would be so much, $50,000. Another one suggested a different approach. For instance, making interview to a sample cost 60,000, etc. Now, the door of the room was left open. That is not because the director, having studied what I just said, he knew that the rooms should always be open. Never. So in the corridor, there was a man, black man, who was cleaning the pavement. And so while working, he was able to listen to the discussion. At a certain point, this man knocked at the door and said, Director, I have an idea. The collaborators to the director watched him said, do you perhaps want to listen to that man? Somebody who is cleaning, blah, 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 and is also black? Never. But the director said, no, let us get him. And at that point he said, look, in the past few days, it was rainy days. So the visitors who came to the museum, they had their shoes which were not clean. And so I am able to say which paintings were the mostly appreciated, because underneath the painting, I can discover what I can polish, because I'm in charge of polish. Now, the director immediately gave him a prize of $1,000 as a gift, and he rebuked the answers. And he halfway said, first of all, you are discriminating a human being, but secondly, because you have remained Tayloristic, and so you are stupid. And now I will let you off. And so you understand the consequences of that. Now, this is an actual fact which occurred 4 years ago. In other words, even a person in that condition was able to externalize an idea, of course a modest idea, but it was a winning idea, etc. Now, if you consider the called the Olivetti, 1960. But in his days, he organized the factory, and Olivetti is one of the all over the world, mostly known company, in spite of the fact that now it doesn't exist anymore. That's not the mark has remained. Why? Because he anticipated, without knowing the name, the model which I call the holocratic model. And that is the reason why the productivity and the profitability of Olivetti was superior to anybody else. And that created the problem of envy to other companies, in particular to Fiat, the car factory in Turin, because they were envious, because he treated the so-called employee as human beings, not as cattle, as it was the case in Fiat and many other organizations. So these are facts that in those days were not appreciated, but today they are appreciated. And the open source movement is another example. It's not the only one, but it's another example of this movement of ideas that today is spreading in many different parts of the world. Certain countries are running faster than others, but I have reasons to believe that in the next few years, in the next decade, these things will become common knowledge. So it pays to people who are young like you to consider that, because otherwise one runs the risk of remaining obsolete. Certainly, if one is rather adult or old, one does not bother. But if you are young and you have a time horizon in front of you of 20, 30, or even 40 years, it pays to consider this novelty, and finding practical ways of implementing that. But at the beginning of my presentation, the fundamental idea is that motivations are not only extrinsic. I know that this is the fault of the category to which I personally belong, namely the category of economists. Because the economists, they, until very recently, they always misbehaved. Because go and open a textbooks in microeconomics. I have myself written several textbooks in microeconomics, even translated to English. What you read? Homo economicus, which is ridiculous. Today, intelligent people never talk about Homo economicus, because that is a sign of stupidity. Because Homo economicus, most people do not know, first of all, who invented it. You know, what invented the expression Homo economicus? John Stuart Mill. At the middle of 19th century, he was English. He was a liberal person. He was also a philosopher. And he used the Homo economicus in order to ridiculize it. He said, never could be the case that we economists use in our modeling of economics. What happened when he passed away? That the other generation of economists consider Homo economicus as if it were the model. And that is why, as mentioned, Ayn Rand before, etc. And she, in a sense, put to the extremization of the assumption of Homo economicus, with the argument of freedom, which is ridiculous, because people talk in that way. That means that they do not know what is freedom. Because, as you know, freedom or liberty has two characteristics: negative freedom and positive freedom. And so the notion of freedom associated to the work of Ayn Rand was the negative one. But today, nobody cares less about negative freedom, because we want positive freedom. And I take that you know what is the difference between the two notions of freedom. It was Isaiah Berlin, a famous Polish philosopher, who then went to Oxford after the war, who wrote a fundamental book whose title is The Two Notions of Liberty. And if you read, you understand that you can guarantee negative liberty or freedom without assuring positive liberty.
Wow.
Okay.
Thanks a lot. That's cool. It's very cool. Now, we have a few people who are asking questions, so I ask them to be quiet, and it's better if I summarize. The first is Gerta. Gerta, are you still there? If so, please unmute yourself. Gerta? Gerta?
Yes, but I have written my question, actually.
Yeah, you have written several questions. I would ask you if you could summarize it in 5 words, your question, for a 2 minutes answer.
It's really hard to summarize. I will go with the first one. Yeah, I would ask the professor if it is ethical overall to identify such groups based on behavior, as he mentioned at the very beginning, because in different societies, for instance, the capitalism and everywhere, no one would prefer to be identified as social, pro-social, anti-social, or anything in overall. So, but to be emphasized for his professional competencies. What is your opinion about that? And the second question was that do you think that Ayn Rand, but you gave answer for that. I think I get my answer for Ayn Rand, ideologies that produce bad people. I was thinking that while reading her because I have read several books. But I think that showing the system your values and why he needs you is a virtue, is not selfishness. So I wanted your opinion also about that.
Okay, thank you, Gerta. I cannot see your face. It's a pity because I would like to see your face. Anyway, the point is the following, that let me put it this way. In economics, as we know, there are different categories of goods, what we call private goods, public goods, and common goods. And I take it that you know the difference between the three categories of goods. The fact is that right from the beginning, when the economic science started developing, the only category of goods which was considered were private goods. Why? Because the market mechanism functions properly, more or less, with private goods. Everybody knows the law of demand and supply, equilibrium price, blah, 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 etc. Okay? And so, why is that so? Because in the initial stages of the process of development of a country, it is obvious that the category of goods most important are private goods. The typical example of private good is food, is shelter. I need to eat, and that is a private good. So in the production and distribution of private goods, the market mechanism, it's okay. What is the novelty? That already after the Second World War, the new categories of public goods started emerging. And in the production and above all, in the financing of the public goods, the market mechanism stops working. You know the prisoner's dilemma. The prisoner's dilemma, it's a famous game which was introduced in 1951 by Albert Tucker, an American mathematician, exactly to represent the situation facing a public goods. That is why public goods are typically produced by governments, by the state. The typical example of public goods are roads. Can you imagine having a road system produced, organized by private market mechanism? That would be ridiculous. It would be a mess, etc. So in the production of public goods, the government or the state is in a sense incentivized to enter. Now, from the 80s, last century onwards, which means in the last more or less 30, 35 years, the new category of goods have emerged, namely common good. Now, common goods are neither private nor public. What is the typical example of a common good? Environment. Another example is knowledge. Knowledge is a common good. It is neither private nor public. Take the case of environment. Why are we destroying our world? You know what is CO2, CF4, these gases. And that are the characteristics of destroying our pattern of life. Now, why is it so? Because until recently, economics treated environment most of the time as if it were a private good. In other occasions, it's a public good. And the disaster is under our eyes. The point is that the environment is a common good. But believe me, until now, economic theory has no theory of common goods. The only theory on common goods comes from other subjects, in particular political science and sociology, but not economics. Do you want an actual confirmation? Elinor Ostrom. Elinor Ostrom obtained the Nobel Prize in economics in the year 2009, and then she passed away. She had a heart stroke. Why? Because she wrote a famous book whose title is Governing the Commons, where for the first time, she was able to propose a model of organization to deal with common good. Why? Because Ostrom was not an economist. She was a political scientist. And she obtained the Nobel Prize in economics. That is the shame. That economics, after 3 centuries of dominance, because economics is an old subject, it has been unable. Because people pretend, I repeat for the last time, to deal with the environment as if it were a private good, or sometimes a public good, which is not the case. So that is why today, for instance, another example of a common good is knowledge. Why do you have open source? Wikipedia. You know the story of Wikipedia and many other examples. So what we are supposed to do, and in my opinion, you have to do, because you are intelligent people, is to find a theoretical setup which is capable of dealing and suggesting lines of action to deal with common goods. And you can take an example, the environment, you can take a knowledge, or take the case of the virus. Health, this pandemic, what does it teach us? That health is a common good, not a private good. Because if the people get the virus, coronavirus, in China, that is not a Chinese affair, it's a world affair. And in fact, from China, it spread all over. And I know that in this period of Russia, it's a very difficult situation. We are in Italy getting out only in the last few days. But as you know, until 2 or 3 weeks ago, we were in a disaster, okay? And so the virus was not born in Italy, was born elsewhere, okay? So health cannot be treated as if it were a private good, but as a common good. So conclusion, try to think about this, that in the societies of nowadays, the most important categories of goods are common goods, which does not mean that private goods are irrelevant. Of course, this tie, it's a private good. This shirt is a private good, because if I wear, you cannot wear it, etc. But in terms of importance, today the category of goods which is more and more important are common goods. And we are lagging behind because we do not have, as I said, a theoretical setup to deal with. To conclude on that, last November, in England, London, 2 famous economists, English economists, one is called Oswald from Oxford. The other one is from the London School of Economics. They calculated over a time span of the last 20 years in the top 10 journals, economic journals all over the world, top, you know what that means, how many articles and papers were published. And they calculated 3,750 papers. And they counted how many of these 3,750 papers written by economists from all countries of the world were dedicated to the problem of environment, pollution, climate change, etc., etc. You know how many? 55. And they concluded by saying, it is a shame. We are economists, and we are ashamed of that, because it means that over a time span of 20 years, out of 3,000, only 55. And that is, of course, a demonstration of what I just said so far. So we cannot complain if there is no actual solution to the problem, because our policymakers, our politicians, our governments, they do not know to whom they should apply in order to receive a sort of an advice, etc., etc. And so they do not take action. they do not provide a transition towards, for instance, the green economy. Today in Europe, we talk about green economy. But that is a word. If I ask, show to me the model of the green economy, the model does not exist. There are only ideas. There are only final targets, but not models, etc. So try to do that. You can, in police, which means the University of Innovation, you have to do it because you are in a position to innovate. Why? Because you have not been dominated by an economic thought which was characterized by an epoch that today does not exist. So you have an advantage, so to speak.
Wow, Professor Zamagni, thank you so much. You know, now
thank you to you.
We have many more questions. So this means we are inviting you again to give another talk in the future. I hope you will accept it.
Who knows? In any way, I was pleased to spend some time with you. Now, in a few minutes, I have another connection because this is my third today. And then I have a fourth one in a few minutes, and so I have to leave you. But as I said, I see Marcello Misiroli, but Marcello Misiroli is Italian, I believe. So to you, Suchi, many wishes and congratulations for the work that you are carrying on. I hope to see you somewhere, either in Russia. I might come to Moscow. I was committed, Giancarlo, to come to Moscow in last April, but then the coronavirus crisis prevented me. So nobody. And I promise that if I come to Moscow, then I take a flight in 1 hour. I come to see you. Okay?
Okay, that's great. So, you know, the first flight which Aeroflot will restart.
Okay, thank you very much. Ciao.
Thank you.
Ciao.
Bye,
Ciao.
bye. Thank you. Thank you. And now we have like 2 minutes break. But before we go to the break, let me welcome Professor Ivica Krolik, who is just there ready to talk to us about how we can do software engineering for data science and artificial intelligence. You know, this is the first out-of-the-box talk. This is the first large conference in software engineering after the outbreak of a virus, and the other conference has been postponed, so we thought we will give some time also for other aspects of software engineering to take over.
Thank you.
We are ready to go. And now we have, thank you again, Stefano, it was great to talk to you, and now we have a 3 minutes break with Mufi, who will put on music, and then we go ahead, and the program will feature Ivica. Ivica, thanks a lot, and let's be ready for your talk. Mufi, music.
Okay, thank
Where
you.
we change the scene.